Thanks very much, both of you, for those readings. I think you'll sense with both of those readings the strong sense of rhythm within the work of poetry. How conscious are you of that in your writing, or is that part of your natural writing style?
I'm quite conscious of that. I started off, writing poetry, and I mean, one of the things that I love about poetry is exactly that, the music of the language in the poem. And prose can have that same kind of music. And often when I write a sentence and I can't for the moment think of a word I want, I'll actually even put down notation, for what the syllables are going to be, because the actual musical shape of the sentence is as important to me as the sense, it's actually part of the sense.
Joel, you haven't got a microphone, so I don't think I need one. And I don't know why you haven't got one. But can people hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Keep your voices up.
As long as we keep our voices up, and our courage, and our ethics, and everything else. Yes, I'm not conscious when I'm writing of things that people who write about writing think of, things like tone, rhythm, character, development, plot, all those things. They never occur to me when I'm writing. I don't give them a thought. I'm trying to work with the sort of intimate presence of what it is I'm doing, whatever that is, and I don't pretend to understand it. And I'm following that in a kind of such an engaged way, as if I'm driving a truck or driving a train or something. It requires all my attention. Could be something on the line or in jumping across the road, and I'm alert to the wholeness of what I'm doing. And afterwards, I might think of those sorts of things. I don't know, honestly. I really haven't ever given thought to elements of writing as such. They may or may not be there. So it's not something that I kind of am engaged with.
Right. As I warned you at the beginning, I'd come back to those influences of the American Western or the American cinema. Have those impacted it in any ways on your writing?
Oh, look, I think that anybody who's grown up in the age of the cinema and is a writer is immensely more aware of picture making in the writing than people perhaps were once before. So, there's a highly visual element, I think, in almost all modern writing that is sharper than you get in, say, most 19th century fiction writing. And I think that's just a way in which people's minds have changed. All writing tries to deal with all the senses, but the visual sense has become very, very, very prominent, I think, in modern thinking. And I would think that a kind of training we've had in looking at things almost with a camera eye is what has changed in people's sensibility over the last 100 years.
Yes, obviously it's true, as David says, and that's something that goes on in us in an unconscious way too. We've sort of become solidified by our ages that we're in. And the modern novel just can't do and doesn't do what the 19th century novel did. You can't go into these great discursive asides that go on for 200 pages and then come back to where you were again and retain your audience. Retain your reader, and it's just not the way we live anymore. It's not only the sort of visual, it's also the temporal, and those things have just changed so much for us. We no longer have time. We used to have time. When in my mother's day she didn't have a washing machine or a dishwasher or a vacuum cleaner, so she had plenty of time. We had holidays. Dad worked full-time, but somehow he came with us, and or we went off for the day into the country and lay down in the grass And we're, sorry, far too busy again for that. Now, how is the time? Because we haven't got much of it, whatever it is, it's pressing upon us. It didn't used to. There was an unawareness, in a sense, of time, a much more acute, intense awareness of landscape, and I would sort of take a little bit of issue with that, in that I suppose I didn't have a television until a few years ago, so I wasn't terribly affected by that. Lived in the country a lot, didn't go to the movies very much anyway. But and nevertheless, those things had their effect on me. Of course, it's a subliminal effect. It's part of our age. But it's the change in the tempo of our lives that's most affected the nature of the novel, I think, rather than the visual change. It's not one or the other. It's all of these things. But that's the biggest impact it's had, and you just don't have 3-volume novels. Well, I mean, you do. Underworld, for example, as soon as you say you don't have this, you don't have that. I remember Murray Bale, no, it wasn't Murray, it was someone else, said years ago, oh, the immigrant novel has been written, and then someone wrote this brilliant immigrant novel. You know, as soon as you say that, you think, right, Underworld, come on. You know, that could easily be. It's so big, it's a massive, wonderful novel, and I think it's probably just about the best 20th century novel. 3 volumes, yeah, that could fit into 3 volumes. So I'm wrong, but never mind.
There's an interesting thing about the highly visual nature of a lot of 20th century writing, that people assume from that your books, because they're highly visual, will be filmable. And I think my books are just completely unfilmable. So I'm astonished that people keep taking out options on them. And I mean, grateful, but it does seem to me that the 20th century novel, precisely because film exists, perhaps, has moved further and further away from a kind of narrative form which is filmable. And I mean, you know, basically in any of my books, nothing is happening except in people's heads. And so I mean, I don't know how you would film it. I realise that you read lots and lots of novels that are really just pieces of fiction waiting to be made into films. But I'm talking about another kind of novel. And most novels that are real novels of a 20th century kind basically won't make a film.
Have any of them got to screenplay stage?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes, many times, and many versions of the screenplay. And many versions because the difficulties are there. You know, you keep having to find action that will illustrate something which is happening in a different way in the prose.
I mean, Proust is an unfilmable novel where really nothing happens. And the best there was a visualisation of Proust done, and I think the script was written by the greatest screenwriter ever, in my opinion, whose name I've forgotten.
There's a printed script by Pinter.
Pinter, thank you.
Pinter.
And it was staged at the Victorian College of the Arts some years ago, and I saw it advertised, and I've read and loved Proust for years and years and years, and reread and go back and read volume 12 again and all that time regained. Yeah, it's sort of constant companion of your life. And I thought, no, it's impossible. I'll have to go and see this. So I went with a sense of dread, and it was marvellous. And I thought, okay, so the answer to your question is the filmmaker will know how to make the film. If the filmmaker is a good filmmaker, they will make a beautiful film of your book in the end, if you're lucky. I mean, and if you're just normally, if you're not particularly lucky, they'll make some horrible bloody thing.
But basically, I mean, almost all films I've ever seen of what I think of as being great or even good books are something different. They're not the book.
No.
And they're less than the book. And what's gone is the voice of the writer and the voice of the writing. Like those, for me, truly terrible versions of Jane Austen on the television.
What's your feeling about Grapes of Wrath?
That's a great film. Probably, they're not a great book.
We were talking about, in the earlier session, we were talking about Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, which Sonia hadn't read but carries around with her. When it's sort of all forgotten about, then she'll read it. But the film of that book was actually better than the book. Because there was a huge dimension in the book that was missing. The women in the book were just cardboard cutouts, like they were the shape of women, but there was nothing there in them. And that's one of the problems with me with Cormac McCarthy's work. There's no humour and there are no women, not real women. The film had real women and they were terrific. The gear, the horses, Cormac McCarthy's observation of the way in which horses move with the weight of a man on them, rest, unrest, prepare, it's like watching ballet dancers, is perfect. His register for that is perfect in his writing. It's just magical. It's poetry. It's so uncluttered and so perfectly observed. And they even got that in the movie. I don't know who made it. The movie failed. It was a flop, of course, because all those really good movies are flops. People look at them and think, there was some sex, I think, actually. Obviously, something was missing that nobody got, but I thought it was marvellous.
Look, we probably have a few minutes for questions. Alan.
You seem to base characters and events very strongly on things that you ascribe to actual life. You name a person who the character is based on and so on.
I write about people I know and love. Look, I was at the West Australian Festival whenever it was, last year or early this year. Where are we? I don't know, July or something. But it was whenever. And a questioner in the audience said, in your book, Landscape of Farewell, this one, the character Vita McClelland is based, I believe, on Anita Heiss. And I said, yes, that's right. And he said, I know Anita, and she is a much more complex and interesting person than your character. And my answer to that was that literalism is the enemy of art. And that it's my impression. It's not the person. There was that also arose at the earlier session where basing characters on real people or imaginary people. There are wholly imagined people in my books as well. They're there from necessity. Lien in the Ancestor game was received in China as my portrait of a 1920s famous Chinese actress who I'd never heard of. But they insisted, no, you got her right, that's her. But she was purely invented. So I do that as well. In Stone Country, Panya, the old dark, the woman at the end of the book, she is purely invented. I mean, Bo Rennie or Col McLennan, the real person, says to me, well, the old people give it to you, mate. That's where she came from the unconscious. I mean, for me, writing is a conversation with the unconscious, as well as drawing on real people who I love and care about. I don't write about evil, villain people. I've tried, it doesn't work. They recognise themselves and say, hey, that's me, you made me a short bastard. Well, I didn't want you to recognise yourself. No, that's me, mate. And they don't seem to mind, but I start out trying to write a person as an evil person, or as somebody I really don't like very much, and I sort of get to the point where I begin to see their point of view. And I think, I can understand why you're behaving like that,
Okay, I think Anna, you had Oh, sorry, David, did you want to add to that?
No.
Did you have a question?
Alex, what does Germany mean to you?
That's a good question, Anna. Yeah, it means, the great thing about Germany, for me, I suppose, as a boy, was they were the enemy. They were going to kill us all. I brought up in London, and we stayed in London throughout the air raids. So, they were trying to kill us. And we were subjected to the most intense propaganda to hate Germans. And so I grew up with that and had enormous effect. Dad was away at the war for 4 years, came back badly wounded, his life changed, our lives changed. And I'm a 20th century writer. I'm not a 21st century person, and I'm a European. So the great sort of historical trouble of Germany culminated finally. Germany, as people say how important literature is not important. Literature is irrelevant. It has it's been proved to me in my century, the 20th century, that the most devotedly literary culture that Europe ever produced at its height followed Hitler to hell. Not only willingly, but with enthusiasm. And that simple fact, it seems to me, when I hear that the word is more powerful than the sword, I think, what nonsense. It's how we behave that is important to the people around us, not what we say. Not what we say, but what we do and how we do what we do is much more important than what we say or the words that we write. And I write to save my own soul, and if anybody else enjoys it, fantastic. For me, it's therapy. It's a way to live, which is not an answer to your question. There isn't a simple answer. It looms enormously large in my life, and as it must anyone, any 20th century person of my age, whose mum and dad were right there, whose generation of our fathers, my father, fought that war. You know, I mean, he was wounded just after the Battle of Cayenne, when the last SS, it was all over, it was finished. And the last sort of SS troops were prepared to just die and kill as many people as they could on the way. And there were just terribly vicious final battles there. And Dad was half destroyed in one of those. And that madness was the most devotedly literary country in the world did that. Where were the books? I mean, I know Simone Weil has said there's a handful of books, of great works, I should say, not necessarily books, of great works of art. And she disagrees with Steiner on this, who says that, you know, I don't agree. Simone doesn't give us the list. I agree with, you know, I mean, I think for me and for a lot of people of my time, of my age, who remain utterly bewildered by it. There is no answer, I don't have any answers. Who remain bewildered by that, by what happened in Germany, by the Holocaust, by the total, absolute inhumanity of what happened, the horror of it. I was having lunch with Jacob Rosenberg the other day, and he just said, out of the blue, "Alex, I can't understand." And we went on talking about it, and he said, "We're a pack of wolves." And I said, "Well, you've got to tell your grandchildren that." He said, "How can I? How can I tell my grandchildren that?" I mean, it takes a lot of courage to voice pessimism at that age. To voice your pessimism, voice pessimism about life takes a lot of courage. It's not an easy thing to do. Very few of us care to face up to that. So it's got to do with all that stuff.
You have a question here?
So David, how important is the feeling of telling a story for you when you sit down to write?
Well, I don't have a story to tell until the writing has happened, I would say. You know, it's not as if I have an anecdotal story which I'm now setting out on. What I'm interested in is either a situation or a group of characters or a single character. And what I'm interested in is seeing where that leads me. You know, I don't have any plan at all when I start a book. I might have a notion of a piece of action in the middle of the book, or I might even have a notion of where I want the book to end up, but I don't know what the book is. So I'm really relying on my own interest, either in as I say, in a character or in a situation, to reveal to me, you know, something that may turn out to be a story, but maybe just turn out to be a series of unfolding and mysteriously related events. And I assume always, as I think all writers do, that if something interests them enough, and it seems like a mystery that they want to work through, that you know, as a writer, as a person, I'm not so unusual that there won't be a number of people out there who are willing to go on that with me. And you know, I think that's all a writer can do. You can't. Stories don't really interest me until they've attached themselves either to a situation or to a character or group of characters.
There's that sense too, isn't there? We often hear it, that story is something simple and that we all know what it is. We don't. It's a mystery. Mm-hmm. Story is a mystery. It is either there or it isn't there. There's that wonderful thing of Kafka's where he says in these few brief sentences, Two men were drinking at the very back of the cafe at a table. The proprietor was sitting at the front in the sun, dozing. A man and a woman were standing at the edge of the lagoon with their backs to the cafe. In the distance, a boat was coming towards the landing strip. These are all separate sentences, in a sense unrelated, but building together this picture. The boat landed. Two men got off the boat carrying a bier, a coffin. It was probably, the last sentence says, it was probably the body of the Duke. It's a story suddenly. Suddenly these separated sentences are a story. They blossom into this story, as surprising to Kafka, no doubt, as to us.
The shape of those sentences is the one I think that we all recognise as where all stories begin and where all good pieces of writing find themselves, which is in the world of dream. I mean, the first stories we ever really follow are the stories we follow in our own dreams, and they always have that mysterious sense of being both the visions or the acts being connected to one another, but in some really mysterious way. And what the source of the connection might be is really what most writers are following.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. But that is that little Kafka piece. It's like a De Chirico painting.
Sure.
And sometimes Kafka is illustrated by De Chirico, where you'll have that fugitive figure in the distance. You know, what's that painting? The enigma of arrival, the enigma of something else. Time. That's it. Yeah. And in that painting, there's a little figure like a Rick Amor figure up in the tower. And you notice that figure last, in a sense, because your mind is taken with the one at the front, that sort of thing. And in that, suddenly when you notice that little figure, it becomes a story. The picture becomes a story.
I'd say that one of the things you learn as a writer is to trust that kind of dreamscape and putting yourself into the kind of half-sleep, half-waking consciousness, which is like dreaming, is where the best writing comes from. That's something you learn, I think, to do. And you especially have to learn to trust it. You have to learn not to interfere and try and start shaping.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to go back to those markers in time, for that particular way things were written, it was a different time and place. And what do you think about rewriting to really improve the structure of a story, to rewrite sentences in particular?
Look, I think that can't be done. I think that things that are done at a certain time in your life have their own kind of authenticity that belongs to both you and to everything else of the time. But also there's a quality there, and it's very, very difficult for you as a writer to see what it is that gives life to that particular piece of writing. And going back and wanting to improve it in some kind of way often removes precisely the thing which might be its own awkwardness, which gives it life and freshness. So I think all you can say is, that's what I did then, what I could do then. I can't be the person now who goes back and thinks myself into that piece of writing so that I can be true to the piece of writing if I start trying to rewrite it. So I would never do that.
And that's true for both your fiction and your poetry.
Yeah. And I've tried with poems, and I'm always haunted by the example of Auden, who did rewrite poems. Almost everybody prefers the originals, awkward as they might be, full of things that he felt he no longer believed in. Fancy going back and trying to rewrite your life in terms of what you now believe.
Yeah, I agree with David on that, and it has been attempted, and there's controversy, always disagreement between Henry James did quite a bit of it towards the end of his life, and generally people seem to think it didn't improve things, but there are those who say yes, it did. I couldn't, like David, I couldn't imagine doing it. I just couldn't bear to do it. I do, of course, reading anything, and this is another thing really, reading something, while I'm reading it, I'm actually rewriting it. What I read just now, there were quite a lot of changes. If you've been trying to follow it on the page, you know, thought, hang on, he's not reading what's there. I mean, 99% of it was, but you improve it always. There's kind of no end to the revision, so it's not something that's static. It hasn't quite stopped for you.
I always want to stand up very strongly for awkwardness.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think sometimes awkwardness is all we've got. And, you know, that when people recognise, it's interesting that when you have a first novel, I mean, Jono, which was my first novel, had the worst reviews you could ever have seen. There was not a single favourable review, I think. But the interesting thing about that, to me, was that, you know, when the third and fourth book come along, the things that people like about the writing are exactly the things that they didn't like about the first book, because there was something about that was not what they were expecting. And there was a kind of awkwardness in it. And after a certain time, they come to recognise that as being the quality of your writing. And if they're responding to the writing at all, that's what they like. That's why I really worry about a certain kind of editing and a certain kind of creative writing teaching, and that is that people are really being taught, and certainly this happens in editing, to solve problems all in the same way. And in fact, your own awkward way of solving the problem or getting the sentence straight is you, and you maybe don't want to lose that.
And I mean, all the great books have great flaws, and critics love finding them. I mean, imagine redoing Moby Dick. There's about, you know, nearly 100 pages that you could do without easily.
Now we have an extremely awkward moment because I'm going to have to cut off this discussion. Can you join me in thanking David and Alex? Thank you very much.